January 11th, 1944, 0742 hours, 30,000 feet above the frozen spine of Europe. The coal was already inside the aircraft long before the engines reached full power. It crept through seams in the aluminum skin, crawled along exposed rivets, and clung to breath itself, turning every exhale into a ghostly cloud that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Frost glazed the inside of the cockpit windows of the B-17G flying fortress, known as Ye Old Pub, blurring the world beyond into a pale wash of white and steel gray. Below them, the North Sea lay hidden beneath a ceiling of cloud, dark and indifferent. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, waited Germany. The bomber shuddered slightly as the throttles were advanced. 4 Wright Cyclone engines roared in uneven harmony, their vibration traveling through the fuselage and into the bones of every man aboard. It was a familiar sound, one that lived in their dreams and followed them into sleep. But today it carried a different weight. No one spoke it aloud, yet every man felt it. The quiet sense that this mission would not be like the others. Captain Charles "Charlie" Brown sat in the left seat, gloved hands firm on the yoke, eyes fixed ahead. At 21 years old, he carried a responsibility that felt far older than his years. His co-pilot, Spencer "Pinky" Luke, scanned the instrument panel with mechanical precision, his breath fogging his oxygen mask. Behind them, the navigator hunched over his charts, pencil steady despite the vibration, plotting a course that would take them deep into the heart of the Reich. This was not a raid meant to wound, it was meant to cripple. Their target was Oschersleben, a manufacturing center feeding the Luftwaffe's hunger for fighter aircraft. Focke-Wulf plants churned out the very machines that had torn American bombers apart for months. Intelligence reports said production was increasing, not slowing. That made today's mission necessary and dangerous. The sky ahead slowly filled with shapes, hundreds of them, as bomber formations converged from across eastern England. B-17s and B-24s slid into their assigned boxes with practiced discipline, wings nearly overlapping, propellers carving the air in synchronized thunder. From above, it would have looked like a metallic armada moving with purpose, a nation's will made visible. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the interphone crackled with routine checks. Engines stable, fuel pressure normal, oxygen flowing, guns charged, ammunition belts feeding cleanly. Each man performed his task with muscle memory drilled into him by months of training and fear. No one talked about the odds. By 9:15 hours, the English coast fell away behind them. The North Sea stretched below, dull and lifeless, a cold grave for anyone unlucky enough to go down. The bomber climbed steadily, the air thinning, the cold intensifying. Ice formed along the edges of the wings, catching the weak winter sun like broken glass. Then the flak began. At first it was distant, black blossoms blooming far below, harmless as smoke. But as the formation pushed deeper inland, the bursts climbed to meet them. The sky became a minefield of violent eruptions, each one capable of tearing a bomber apart. The aircraft bucked as shock waves slammed into its frame. Somewhere off to the right, a B-17 took a direct hit and disintegrated in a flash of orange and black, debris spinning away like falling stars. No parachutes followed. Inside Ye Olde Pub, silence fell. No one said a word, but every man saw it. Every man understood what it meant. The intercom crackled again. Fighters, 12 o'clock high. They came out of the sun like demons. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, sleek and fast, noses flashing as they rolled into attack formation. These were not inexperienced pilots. These were hunters. The first pass was sudden and violent. Cannon shells tore through the air with a sound like ripping cloth. The nose of the bomber exploded inward as a 20-millimeter round struck home. Plexiglass shattered. The navigator jerked back, a red bloom spreading across his chest as he collapsed without a sound. The bombardier screamed as fragments tore through his shoulder. The aircraft lurched. Alarm shrieked. Someone shouted for a medic, though everyone knew there wasn't one. Another burst hit the tail. The entire aircraft shuddered violently, yawing hard to the right. Control cables snapped. The tailgun fell silent. For a heartbeat, the bomber hung in the air, wounded and unstable, its fate undecided. Then gravity took hold. The nose dipped. The horizon tilted. Loose equipment slammed against the walls. The engine screamed as Brown fought the controls, muscles straining, jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. The B-17 groaned like a living thing, protesting every correction. Somehow, impossibly, it leveled out. But the formation was gone. Ahead there was only open sky, and behind them 15 enemy fighters were turning in for the kill. The sky around Ye Olde Pub felt suddenly enormous and impossibly empty, as though the world itself had stepped back to watch what would happen next. The bomber no longer belonged to the formation. It had been cast out, stripped of protection, drifting alone in the hostile airspace like a wounded animal that had fallen behind the herd. The engines continued their uneven roar, but now every vibration felt wrong. Every shudder a reminder that the aircraft was flying on borrowed time. Inside the fuselage, chaos reigned in silence. The interphone crackled uselessly, voices cutting in and out through static and damage. The navigator lay slumped forward, unmoving, his chart stained dark. The bombardier fought to stay conscious, pressing gloved hands against his wound, breath coming in ragged bursts that fogged his mask. Blood had begun to freeze where it touched the metal floor, turning slick and treacherous beneath the crew's boots. Outside, the German fighters regrouped. They did not rush this moment. They circled. 15 aircraft, sleek, predatory shapes, spread out in a loose ring around the crippled bomber, their propellers flashing as they banked through the thin winter light. From a distance, they looked almost graceful, like birds of prey testing the wind. Up close, they were instruments of precision killing. The men aboard Ye Olde Pub could see the crosses painted on the wings. They could see the pilots' helmets, the glint of canopies. One gunner muttered a prayer. Another checked his ammunition belt, knowing there wasn't enough left for what was coming. The first attack came from above and behind. A pair of Focke-Wulfs dove in, cannons blazing. Tracer fire stitched across the bomber's wings, ripping through aluminum and internal ribs. One engine coughed violently, belching smoke before stabilizing again. The aircraft lurched as if struck by a giant hand. The tail gunner did not respond. No return fire came from the rear. Inside the cockpit, Charlie Brown felt it in his gut before he saw it on the instruments. They were losing control authority. The bomber's tail surfaces had taken catastrophic damage. Only constant pressure on the yoke kept them level, and even that felt like holding back a collapsing wall. Another pass, then another. The Luftwaffe pilots were methodical now, conserving ammunition, probing for weakness. They knew this bomber could not escape. They were simply deciding how to kill it. Inside the aircraft, fear thickened the air. Not the panicked kind, but the heavy, suffocating kind that pressed down on every thought. The kind that made time stretch and contract in strange ways. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt endless. The radio operator tried again to call for help, but only static answered. The formation was miles ahead. No one could hear them. No one was coming back. A shell punched through the radio compartment and detonated inside, spraying fragments that tore through equipment and flesh alike. Smoke filled the fuselage, acrid and stinging. Someone screamed, then went silent. The aircraft dropped another 100 feet. The altimeter needle spun slowly downward. One of the engines began to lose power, coughing unevenly. Fuel pressure fluctuated. The bomber was bleeding speed. Then, without warning, the attack stopped. For a moment, there was only the sound of the engines and the wind. The gunners scanned the sky wildly, fingers tight on triggers, waiting for the next wave. But nothing came. Instead, a single Messerschmitt peeled away from the circling group and eased closer. It did not fire. It approached slowly, cautiously, sliding into position off the bomber's left wing. Close enough now that the men inside could see the pilot's face behind the canopy glass. He was young, calm, focused. Inside the German cockpit, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler studied the wreck before him. He saw the torn fuselage, the blood, the dead tail gunner slumped motionless in his turret. He saw a bomber that should not still be flying, and something in him resisted. Stigler had grown up believing in honor, in rules, even in war. His former commander had once told him that shooting a defenseless man was murder, not combat. That lesson had never left him. Now, staring at this broken aircraft, he felt it rise in his chest like a physical weight. He moved his fighter closer, so close that he could see the faces inside. Wide eyes, frozen expressions, men waiting to die. Inside ye olde pub, panic spiked. The gunners tracked the fighter, expecting the final burst. Fingers tightened on triggers, but it never came. Instead, the German pilot lifted one gloved hand and gestured. At first, the Americans didn't understand. Then he pointed downward, toward the German countryside below, and then back toward the bomber, repeating the motion slowly. Land. Surrender. Charlie Brown shook his head, unsure if the German could see him, but the message was clear enough. They would not surrender. They couldn't. For a long moment, the two aircraft flew side by side, enemies suspended in a strange, fragile truce. Wind howled between them. Engines roared in uneven harmony. Then the German pilot did something no one on board would ever forget. He raised his hand in a crisp, unmistakable salute. And in that instant, everything changed. For a few suspended heartbeats, the sky seemed to hold its breath. Two aircraft, one battered, bleeding, barely alive, the other sleek and lethal, flew side by side in a frozen moment that did not belong to war. The roar of engines filled the thin air, yet inside the cockpit of Ye Olde Pub, everything felt eerily silent, as though the world itself were waiting to see what choice would be made. The German pilot's salute lingered in the air longer than any command ever could. Charlie Brown stared through the fractured plexiglass, scarcely trusting his eyes. Every instinct screamed that this was a trick, that at any second the Messerschmitt would roll inverted and rake the bomber with cannon fire. His hands tightened around the controls, knuckles white beneath his gloves, but something deeper, something untrained and profoundly human, told him this moment was different. Across the narrow gulf of cold air, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler studied the men inside the bomber. He could see their fear plainly now, etched into their posture, their stillness. These were not faceless enemies in the sky. They were young men clinging to life inside a dying machine. The tail gunner was slumped unnaturally, clearly dead. The nose was shredded. The bomber listed like a wounded animal, one wing lower than the other. Stigler felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with altitude. He had downed aircraft before, many of them. He had watched parachutes blossom and sometimes fail. He had seen fire consume men in seconds. That was war. That was duty. But this was something else. His fuel was low. His ammunition was nearly gone. His orders were clear. Yet none of that mattered anymore. He edged his aircraft closer, aligning himself with the B-17's wing, close enough that he could see the fear in the eyes staring back at him. He raised his hand again, gesturing insistently toward the ground. Land. Save yourselves. Inside the bomber, the crew exchanged glances. Some shook their heads, others stared forward, frozen. They all knew what landing in Germany would mean: prison camps, interrogations, uncertainty. Yet even that seemed better than dying in the sky. Still, the aircraft could barely fly. The landing gear was damaged. The tail barely held together. There was no guarantee they could land at all. Charlie Brown made the decision without words. He shook his head once, firmly. The German pilot hesitated. Then slowly, deliberately, he moved his fighter forward and slightly outward, positioning himself between the bomber and the distant horizon where other Luftwaffe units patrolled. It was a subtle movement, but unmistakable in its intent. He was shielding them. For several long minutes, the two aircraft flew together, one wounded, one guarding, while the skies stretched endlessly around them. Below, the patchwork of Germany slid past, fields and forests blurring together. No shots were fired, no radios crackled. Only the wind and engines bore witness. Then, as the coastline approached and the dark slate of the North Sea came into view, Stigler made his choice. He rolled his aircraft gently to the side, leveled out, and brought it alongside the B-17 one final time. He looked over, raised his hand again in salute, and held it there. Then he pulled away. The Messerschmitt banked sharply, turning back toward the Reich, disappearing into the haze as if it had never been there at all. Inside Ye Olde Pub, no one spoke. Some men wept openly. Others stared straight ahead, afraid that if they looked back, the moment would vanish. The bomber limped on alone. The engines coughed and sputtered, threatening to fail at any moment. Fuel gauges danced unpredictably. The altimeter crept downward. Every vibration felt like the beginning of the end. The North Sea stretched beneath them. Dark, cold, merciless. If the aircraft went down now, there would be no survivors. The crew braced themselves for whatever came next. And then, through the haze, the English coastline emerged like a promise. The English coast did not appear all at once. It revealed itself slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the land itself were unsure whether to welcome them back. At first, there was only a subtle change in the color of the horizon, a faint gray line where sky met sea. Then shapes began to form. Cliffs, fields, hedgerows, blurred by altitude and exhaustion. To the men inside ye old pub, it looked like salvation suspended on the edge of collapse. The bomber was barely flying now. The engines had lost their steady rhythm, coughing and sputtering as fuel lines struggled to maintain pressure. Oil streaked back across the wings, black against frost-white metal. The aircraft vibrated unevenly as though one wrong movement might tear it apart midair. Every man aboard understood that they were no longer fighting the enemy. They were fighting physics. Charlie Brown kept both hands locked on the controls, his forearms burning with strain. He could feel every tremor of the aircraft, every shudder transmitted through the yoke. His jaw ached from clenching. His shoulders were stiff, locked in position, unwilling to relax even for a moment. The altimeter needle trembled just above the minimum needed to stay airborne. Behind him, the remaining crew worked in silence. There was no energy left for conversation, no need for commands. Each man did what little he could, monitoring failing systems, bracing against the aircraft's unpredictable movements, praying in private. The radio operator attempted one last transmission, his voice cracking as he called out their position and condition. Static answered him at first. Then, faintly, a reply emerged. Broken, distorted, but unmistakably English. Someone had heard them. That knowledge alone felt like a lifeline. Below them, the cold gray water of the North Sea stretched endlessly. The bomber was too damaged to climb, too slow to evade anything that might rise to meet it. If the engines failed now, there would be no chance of ditching safely. The water temperature would kill them in minutes. But the engines kept turning. Minutes passed like hours. The coastline grew clearer. Fields gave way to roads, roads to buildings. And finally, far ahead, a familiar shape appeared. An RAF airfield, its runways faintly visible through the haze. The sight nearly broke them. Ground crews were already scrambling, alerted by the battered silhouette limping toward them. No one had expected to see that aircraft again. No one could believe it was still airborne. As Yaolda Pub descended, the true extent of its damage became horrifyingly clear. The tail section hung at an unnatural angle, nearly torn away. The fuselage was pockmarked with hundreds of holes, some large enough to crawl through. Control surfaces barely responded. The landing gear groaned as it lowered, protesting the strain. Inside the cockpit, Brown guided the bomber down with hands that felt more like stone than flesh. He eased back on the yoke, fighting every instinct to pull too hard, knowing that one sudden movement could shear the aircraft in half. The runway rushed toward them. For a moment, it seemed they would overshoot. Then the wheels struck the ground, hard. The aircraft bounced once, lurched violently to the left, then slammed down again. Metal screamed, tires smoked. The bomber skidded, veered, and finally rolled to a shuddering stop just short of the far end of the runway. Silence followed. No one moved. Then, slowly, painfully, the crew began to climb out. Ground personnel stared in disbelief. Some froze where they stood. Others ran forward, hands over mouths. Medics rushed in, shouting for stretchers. The sight before them barely resembled a functioning aircraft. 2 men were dead, several were gravely wounded. And yet, against all reason, the rest had survived. As the crew was helped down, one of the mechanics walked the length of the fuselage, counting holes out of habit more than necessity. He stopped when he reached 200, then kept counting. Later, one of the officers would quietly say that the aircraft should never have made it back, that by every known rule of aerodynamics and damage assessment, it should have fallen from the sky long before reaching the coast. But it hadn't. In the days that followed, reports were written, forms filled out, and statements recorded. The incident was logged as heavy combat damage sustained over Germany. The enemy fighters were noted. The losses were recorded. What was not written down, what could not be written, was the moment of mercy that had made all the difference. The crew would speak of it only among themselves, voices low, uncertain if anyone would believe them. A German fighter pilot who chose not to kill, a salute in the sky, a silent escort through enemy airspace. For years, it would remain nothing more than a story shared between men who had lived through it. But history has a way of bringing truth back to the surface. And years later, far from the frozen skies of Europe, two former enemies would meet again. Older, changed, bound by a moment that had defined them both. The war did not end that day, and for the men of ye old pub, survival did not mean peace. The days that followed were filled with hospitals, debriefings, and long hours of waiting. Waiting for wounds to heal, for nerves to settle, for the noise inside their heads to quiet. Some of the crew returned to duty. Others were grounded, their bodies or minds no longer able to endure the sky. But none of them ever forgot that flight, or the strange mercy that had carried them home. Official reports reduced the mission to numbers and damage assessments. Aircraft lost, enemy fighters engaged, crew casualties. The encounter with a lone German fighter was omitted entirely. There was no box to check for mercy in the middle of combat. No form for an enemy who chose not to kill. And so the story lived only in memory. For Charles Brown, the memory never faded. In quiet moments, it returned with startling clarity. The frozen air, the ruined tail, the German pilot's face. So close he could almost see the color of his eyes. Brown would later admit that it haunted him not with fear, but with wonder. In a war defined by hatred and destruction, one man had chosen something else. Years passed. The war ended in fire and surrender. Europe rebuilt itself from rubble. Lives moved forward, reshaped by what they had endured. Brown returned home, married, built a life. Yet the question lingered inside him like an unfinished sentence. Who was that pilot, and why did he spare us? Across the ocean, in a country struggling to redefine itself after defeat, Franz Stigler lived with the same memory. He never spoke of it publicly. In post-war Germany, such a story could bring misunderstanding, even condemnation. He had disobeyed orders. He had spared an enemy. That was not something to boast about. Still, the image never left him. The wounded bomber, the terrified faces, the choice that had weighed on him in the sky. He would later say that in that moment, he had not seen enemies. He had seen men who would die if he pulled the trigger, and he could not live with that. Decades passed. In 1986, driven by a need he could no longer ignore, Charles Brown placed an ad in a veteran's newsletter. He described the mission, the damaged B-17, the German fighter that had escorted them to safety. He asked simply if the pilot was still alive. Months went by with no reply. Then one day a letter arrived. It was from a man named Franz Stigler. The words were simple, almost restrained, but their meaning was unmistakable. He described the same encounter from the opposite side of the sky, the same damaged bomber, the same decision, the same salute. Two men separated by war, connected again by memory. They met in person in 1990 at a gathering of American bomber veterans. When they saw each other across the room, there was no hesitation, no awkwardness. They embraced like old friends who had simply been apart for too long. Those who witnessed it said there were tears in both their eyes. They spoke not of politics or ideology, but of fear, of youth, of the strange clarity that comes when life hangs by a thread. They laughed at small details only they could understand. They mourned the men who never made it home. From that day on, they remained close until their deaths, bound by a moment that defied the logic of war. Their stories spread slowly at first, then widely. Historians took notice. Documentaries were made. The world listened. And in listening, many understood something profound. War is made of orders, strategies, and machines, but it is fought by human beings. And sometimes, even in the darkest skies, humanity survives. Time has a way of softening memories, but it does not erase them. For those who flew in the cold upper reaches of the European sky, the war never truly ended. It simply grew quieter. The engines faded, the gunfire stopped, yet the echoes lingered in dreams, in sudden silences, in the way certain sounds could still tighten the chest without warning. For Charles Brown and Franz Stigler, The years that followed carried the quiet weight of a shared moment that neither history books nor medals could fully contain. After their reunion, the story of the damaged B-17 and the German fighter pilot began to circulate more widely. Journalists listened with skepticism at first, then fascination. Military historians examined flight logs, squadron reports, mission timings. Slowly, the fragments aligned. Records from the 91st Bomb Group matched Luftwaffe patrol schedules. Witness accounts from both sides echoed the same improbable sequence of events. What once seemed impossible hardened into truth. Yet for the men themselves, validation mattered less than understanding. Brown often spoke about that day not as a miracle, but as a burden that had shaped him. He described how survival carried its own kind of weight, the responsibility to live well in honor of those who had not made it back. He would sit quietly at reunions, listening to laughter echo off hall walls, his eyes sometimes drifting far away, back to the frozen sky over Germany where fate had hesitated. Stigler, too, carried his memories with care. In post-war Germany, he rebuilt his life slowly, deliberately. He rarely spoke of combat, and when he did, he chose his words with precision. He did not glorify the war. He spoke instead of fear, of youth, of moments when instinct and conscience collided. He said that in that moment beside the B-17, he did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man faced with a choice he could not ignore. Their story, when told publicly, unsettled some and inspired others. It challenged the simple narratives of enemy and ally, of good and evil neatly divided by uniforms. It reminded listeners that war is not made of symbols, but of people. People who bleed, hesitate, and sometimes choose compassion when hatred would be easier. As years passed, the men grew older. Their hair thinned, their steps slowed. But whenever they met, something in them grew lighter. They laughed easily together, sharing meals, memories, and the strange bond of having once faced death on opposite sides of a gun sight. In interviews, Brown was often asked why he believed Stigler had spared him. He never claimed to know for certain. "I think," he once said, "he saw us not as enemies, but as men who wanted to live. And maybe that was enough." Stigler, when asked the same question, answered quietly, "I could not shoot them. I would not be able to live with myself if I had." Their friendship endured until the end. When Franz Stigler passed away in 2008, Brown mourned him not as a former enemy, but as a brother. When Brown himself died a year later, their stories were already intertwined, inseparable, etched into the shared memory of a war that had taken so much and yet, in rare moments, revealed something profoundly human. The tale of Ye Olde Pub became more than a story of survival. It became a reminder, taught in classrooms, told in documentaries, passed quietly between veterans, that even in the most violent chapters of history, conscience can still intervene, that amid chaos, mercy can exist. And that sometimes the most powerful acts of courage are not found in pulling a trigger, but in choosing not to. Years passed, and with them the world changed in ways neither man could have imagined, while suspended over Europe in the winter of 1944. Nations rebuilt, borders shifted, new wars were fought under different skies. Yet the story of the damaged B-17 and the German fighter pilot continued to move quietly through time, carried by memory, by testimony, and by those who understood that history is not only shaped by victories, but by moments of restraint. For younger generations, the tale sounded almost unreal. In classrooms and auditoriums, listeners struggled to reconcile the idea of mercy with the machinery of total war. They had grown up on stories of dogfights, heroics, and explosions, clear lines between good and evil. But this story refused to fit neatly into those categories. It lived in the uncomfortable space between duty and conscience. When historians revisited the mission, they found more than just a dramatic anecdote. They uncovered flight logs confirming the damaged aircraft's return, maintenance reports detailing the impossible condition of the fuselage, and Luftwaffe patrol records that aligned eerily well with Stigler's account. Piece by piece, the incident solidified into fact. Yet what mattered most was not the documentation. It was the humanity. At veteran gatherings, younger airmen would sometimes approach Brown, asking what it felt like to face death so closely and survive. He never spoke of heroism. Instead, he talked about fear, raw, paralyzing fear, and about the strange calm that followed it. He spoke about how the world narrows when survival becomes the only objective, how values surface not in grand speeches, but in single, irreversible choices. Stigler, too, spoke when asked, though always with humility. He described the moment he realized the bomber could not defend itself, how the training that had once driven him to pursue kills suddenly fell silent. "I saw them as they were," he said once, "not as enemies, but as men who were going to die." Their story began to appear in books, lectures, and later films. It resonated not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. In a conflict defined by scale, millions of lives, entire continents, their encounter reminded people that war is ultimately experienced one person at a time. For the families of those who had not returned, the story carried a different weight. It did not erase loss, nor did it offer easy comfort, but it suggested that even amid overwhelming destruction, there were moments when humanity flickered through the darkness. As the decades passed, the skies that once thundered with bombers grew quiet. Airports replaced airfields. The roar of radial engines faded into history. Yet somewhere above Europe, in memory if not in fact, two aircraft still flew side by side. One damaged, one guarding, suspended forever in a moment when compassion outweighed orders. And perhaps that is why the story endures. Not because it is extraordinary, but because it reminds us what is possible when a single person chooses to see an enemy as a fellow human being. Time has a way of turning moments into myths, but some stories endure not because they grow larger, but because they remain true. The encounter between the damaged B-17 and the German fighter did not change the outcome of the war. It did not halt the bombings or alter the course of history in any measurable way. Yet its power lies precisely there, in its smallness, in its humanity, in the fragile choice made between two men who would never meet again until decades later. In the years after their reunion, Charles Brown often reflected on that morning over Europe, not with pride, but with humility. He spoke of the men who never came back, of the empty bunks and unfinished letters, of how survival sometimes felt like a burden carried alongside gratitude. He understood that history tends to remember victories and losses, but rarely the quiet moments in between, the moments where a single decision could tilt the weight of a soul. Franz Stigler, for his part, never sought recognition. He lived his later years quietly, working, raising a family, and carrying within him the memory of a choice that had defined his sense of honor more than any medal ever could. When asked once whether he regretted letting the bomber go, he answered without hesitation, "No, I would do it again. I only regret that war put us there at all." Their friendship in later life was not loud or performative. It was gentle, grounded, and deeply human. They spoke often by phone, visited when they could, and shared a bond few could ever truly understand. When one spoke, the other listened, not as former enemies, but as witnesses to the same moment seen from opposite sides of the sky. As time passed, their story began to take on a life beyond them. It was shared in classrooms, aviation museums, veterans halls. Young pilots heard it during training. Historians referenced it as an example of moral courage under unimaginable pressure. It became a reminder that even in systems built for destruction, the individual still matters. The B-17, called Ye Olde Pub, no longer flies. The airfields have changed. The skies over Europe are peaceful now, crossed by civilian aircraft instead of bombers. Yet something remains, an invisible line drawn through history, marking the place where violence paused and humanity spoke. Perhaps that is the true legacy of that day. Not the bullets that missed or the bombs that fell elsewhere, but the moment when a man chose mercy over obedience and another lived because of it. In a war defined by destruction, that choice became an act of quiet defiance, a refusal to let hatred have the final word. And so, when we look back on the skies of January 1944, we do not only see smoke and fire, we see two aircraft flying side by side, suspended between duty and conscience, between death and life. We see proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, there is still room for grace. 10:01 p.m., 23rd of December, 2025. Time has a way of turning moments into myths, but some stories endure not because they grow larger, but because they remain true. The encounter between the damaged B-17 and the German fighter did not change the outcome of the war. It did not halt the bombings or alter the course of history in any measurable way. Yet its power lies precisely there, in its smallness, in its humanity, in the fragile choice made between two men who would never meet again until decades later. In the years after their reunion, Charles Brown often reflected on that morning over Europe, not with pride, but with humility. He spoke of the men who never came back, of the empty bunks and unfinished letters, of how survival sometimes felt like a burden carried alongside gratitude. He understood that history tends to remember victories and losses, but rarely the quiet moments in between, the moments where a single decision could tilt the weight of a soul. Franz Stigler, for his part, never sought recognition. He lived his later years quietly, working, raising a family, and carrying within him the memory of a choice that had defined his sense of honor more than any medal ever could. When asked once whether he regretted letting the bomber go, he answered without hesitation, "No, I would do it again. I only regret that war put us there at all." Their friendship in later life was not loud or performative. It was gentle, grounded, and deeply human. They spoke often by phone, visited when they could, and shared a bond few could ever truly understand. When one spoke, the other listened, not as former enemies, but as witnesses to the same moment seen from opposite sides of the sky. As time passed, their story began to take on a life beyond them. It was shared in classrooms, aviation museums, veterans' halls. Young pilots heard it during training. Historians referenced it as an example of moral courage under unimaginable pressure. It became a reminder that even in systems built for destruction, the individual still matters. The B-17, called Ye Olde Pub, no longer flies. The airfields have changed. The skies over Europe are peaceful now, crossed by civilian aircraft instead of bombers. Yet something remains, an invisible line drawn through history, marking the place where violence paused and humanity spoke. Perhaps that is the true legacy of that day. Not the bullets that missed or the bombs that fell elsewhere, but the moment when a man chose mercy over obedience and another lived because of it. In a war defined by destruction, that choice became an act of quiet defiance, a refusal to let hatred have the final word. And so, when we look back on the skies of January 1944, we do not only see smoke and fire, we see two aircraft flying side by side, suspended between duty and conscience, between death and life. We see proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, there is still room for grace. You like this video? Please subscribe to the Witness Earth Network channel and share it with your friends. We'll see you again soon with another unique and true story from World War II.